You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 484 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He is a staff writer at RT. Hit a pretty big milestone this week, publishing his 1,000th article over at RT. So congratulations to that, Will, and welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks, Kyle. Appreciate that. And thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, well, I'm so happy that you're writing the articles because every week I get a chance to have you on. And you know, I've probably talked about 100 of them or so on the show now. And I think we got a lineup of a few of your articles today that are pretty good. There's a lot of big news, Will, going on, but one of the things that we've been talking about on the show, particularly dealing with the coronavirus, is how it's impacting the U.S., particularly the U.S. Navy, and how it would impact the deployment of U.S. ships to the Caribbean Sea. We mentioned this it looks like a build-up towards war with Maduro. So, Will, one of the things we had talked about at the time, the possibility that coronavirus could impact these ships, and tell us about what's happening on the USS Kidd.
Yeah, so I guess this has kind of become like a regular weekly segment on the show, just how like the coronavirus pandemic is hitting crews on these U.S. warships. And so this week, or I should say last week, actually, by the time this runs, we had the second ship that's actually on deployment to have an outbreak. The first one was the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that was on mission in the South China Sea. It ended up with like 850 cases. One sailor died. The captain got it. But we covered that on a couple previous shows, the whole story of the Roosevelt. But now the second ship that's actually on deployment is a guided missile destroyer, the USS Kidd. And this one was taking part, as you said, in that new drug war mission in the Caribbean that we covered a few weeks ago. It's kind of targeting the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. They singled out Maduro when they announced the mission earlier this month, and then just prior to that, they had also indicted Maduro on these drug trafficking charges. And so it seems pretty clearly like tied in with that and aimed at him. But the outbreak on the Kidd started with one sailor, and then it later jumped to 18, and then now I think it's up to 33 sailors on this ship. And two of them have already been like evacuated off and brought to, I think, a facility in Texas, at least one of them to a hospital in Texas. And I would expect the number of infections to keep going up until they can get this thing to port and get these guys into quarantine. But we should note, too, that like a destroyer is not an aircraft carrier. So like there's like we're talking like 350 crewmen in total here compared to like the 4,000 or 5,000 you would have in an aircraft carrier. And so maybe this is a little more manageable than some of the outbreaks we've seen on aircraft carriers. There's not quite as few, quite as many people in total, but it's also a smaller vessel. So, keep those things in mind. And when they discovered the first infection on board the Kidd, it was actually deployed in the Eastern Pacific off the Mexican coast. And so a lot of this mission that it's taking part in, it's supposed to happen in the Caribbean, but I think they're also doing patrols on the other side of South America there. Like the mission takes place in like the Fourth Fleet zone of the world, which is like, it like rings around South America. So they're supposedly looking for drug traffickers, I guess, all throughout the Eastern Pacific and the Caribbean. And they're using some pretty serious warships to do this mission. I mean, obviously a guided missile destroyer, the Kidd. There's literal combat ships. There's a Coast Guard cutters. There's patrol aircraft, and apparently even like special forces, like ground troops for missions on land and stuff. So this mission is pretty serious in terms of counter narcotics. It's definitely not something that just the police would be doing. But in terms of the Navy's response to this, it seems like they've been a little bit faster and sort of more reactive than they were to the Roosevelt, which would seem like they took a little longer to get help out there. I think it was also a little bit further away from our shores, but nonetheless. With the Kidd, they've already deployed some like a new medical team there to start doing contact tracing and testing everyone on the ship. And then they're also sending this amphibious assault ship that has like its own big medical team to rendezvous with the Kidd. And that's going to come equipped with a bunch of ventilators, which is like some of the, when people get really sick from the coronavirus, they need ventilators. And then it's going to come with a bunch of ICU beds and stuff too. And so like they're sending all this support out to the Kidd right now. And the Kidd is apparently en route back to a port in the U.S. And they didn't really say where it's going to be going. Its home port is in Everett, Washington, off the West Coast. So that could be its destination, but it seemed like they're trying to keep the sort of location stuff vague about where it would end up. So I don't know. You'd think that they would be testing all the sailors on these ships before they get on board these small little floating boxes, and with hundreds of other people with this pandemic going around. And I know they do test in some cases, but nonetheless, we still keep ending up with this virus on warships all over the place. I think we've had like 1,500 sailors in total get infected. A good chunk of those obviously off the Roosevelt, where there's like 850. There were 850. But apparently there have also been like 26 vessels right now that have infections on them in total. And I think 14 other ships had previously been had infections on them. And so that's like a pretty good number of our warships that have had infections. I think there's like 297 in total in our whole fleet, and like 90 of those are on deployment. So I don't know. I think that's a pretty good, big proportion of the ships. They haven't given a breakdown of like every single ship with an infection on it, but in terms of the ones that have been reported on, there's like 4 aircraft carriers, 2 destroyers, 2 amphibious assault ships, a littoral combat ship, and then at least 2 hospital ships. Actually, both of the hospital ships that we sent to help with the coronavirus in New York and LA have had at least one infection on board, and we talked about one of those last week. And so, all these outbreaks have not been as bad as like the one on the Roosevelt, with hundreds of cases and stuff. But it does seem like the ships on deployment were hit harder, the Kidd and the Roosevelt. It seemed like they have had the biggest outbreak so far. They've been the most vulnerable, I guess. Like they're the furthest away from home. They're the farthest away from getting help and support. And I think that's kind of what we've been arguing for a while now, like what we've been kind of warning of, that like the Navy is going to be especially susceptible to this pandemic, and that this might be a good reason to like scale back some of our missions, or at least hold off on starting these new ones that are, thousands of miles away from home. And so, I don't know, I think we've been kind of making that point, and it seems like we've been vindicated week after week.
Right. Well, it seems that unless you could solve the problem of having false negatives on the test results, then you really can't stop the spread of the virus. And also, I would imagine if they're engaged in counter narcotics operations, then you have at least the potential of the crewmen to interact with drug traffickers. And so that seems to me to be probably people who aren't doing a whole lot of great social distancing in all
Right.
cases. If your main goal is to smuggle a few $1 million of cocaine, your chance for risk is pretty high, and so you're probably not washing your hands and wearing a mask as much as everybody else. That's just my prediction. My apologies to all of the germophobic drug traffickers, but that seems to be one problem to me, and so it seems like the only policy you could really have if your goal is to keep American, soldiers as safe as possible and not put them in harm's way, would be to only carry out, military operations that are seen as absolutely essential. What you highlight, this is a counter narcotics operation. This is a time where my guess would be is there's actually less drug smuggling going on. Just there's so much less, commercial traffic, and so much drugs is smuggled through commercial traffic. I will say I had something wrong when I had read this. I thought this ship was in the Caribbean Sea, and so at least this ship was in the area where most of the drug smuggling goes on, the Eastern Pacific, not the Caribbean Sea, where off the coast of Venezuela there's only like 7% of the total drugs. You also had the issue. The war on drugs, I at least to me, was never meant to be literal. It was meant to be kind of like the war on poverty. You're not going to send the military in to shoot the poor people as a solution to the problem. Likewise, you're not going to send the military to counter these drug traffickers. Will, do you know if there's like a posse comitatus type policy or something that says like the U.S. military really shouldn't be getting involved in enforcing civil law? And has anybody stopped to question if Trump has the authority to use the military to enforce drug trafficking law like this?
Well, I know the Pentagon was sort of resistant to this whole idea of like starting this whole mission in the Caribbean, and I guess in the Eastern Pacific as well, for this narcotics stuff. However, in terms of like the laws and like, whether there's some sort of like prohibition on this, I'm not totally sure. But I know that like I think terrorism used to be considered the same kind of thing. Like terrorism is like a crime, and that you send law enforcement after. But now, the world we live in now, it's not like that anymore. Now it's all like a militarized affair where you don't need like an actual regular army to go send the military after. They could, I guess, be a drug trafficker. I guess that's just the world we live in now.
Right. Well, and like I know the Coast Guard has been used, and that seems different to me. in like kind of the different types of military, like having the National Guard do something versus the Army as enforcing immigration law or something like that. There does seem like it should be a difference. Also, you have like these agencies like the DEA that operate everywhere, and these agencies are very, very well militarized, and so how much firepower do you need? It's not like any cartel is rolling out there in a battleship. I'm not sure, what. Do you have an idea on why they like pit these ships, or what the particular like effectiveness of it is, or is it just kind of like a show of force? Do you have any sense of that?
It definitely seems to me that this entire mission is organized just to be like an aggressive gesture toward the Venezuelans. They're talking about drug traffickers and talking about narco terrorism and all this stuff. But in the briefing where they announced this mission, I think Maduro was the only name they mentioned. They didn't call out any other countries. They like, this is all about Venezuela, or at least it's thinly veiled, and it really is about Venezuela. And so, yeah, that's sort of the idea I get too, that we're sending warships just to sort of be closer to Venezuela and send a message that way. I don't know what use a destroyer would be against like drug traffickers. Like you said, it's not like they have their own amphibious assault ships and stuff. Like they're usually on like either smuggling it through commercial ports or on some little dinghy or something, or a speedboat or something. But yeah, I don't think you would need really a destroyer. These drug traffickers may be armed, with rockets at most, or I know that some of like the Mexican cartels and stuff are very heavily armed, but still, I'm not sure like if they could come up against a Navy destroyer or, even like some of these smaller vessels. So yeah, I'm not sure what they would need like these really hardcore warships for.
So, just to kind of wrap up here, Will, is there any indication that like the Navy is waking up and at least like either the enlisted men or like kind of some of the officers are, realizing that I would guess all the captains of the ships have to be talking to their superior officers saying that like, hey, really don't want to be out at sea and have a coronavirus outbreak on this ship. It seems like it's going to be an absolute disaster on my ship. Even if the numbers are lower, because, just in proportion, like you said, there's 400 sailors on these nuclear powered aircraft carriers. 4,000, and then you have 350, 400 on the destroyer, and so obviously you're not going to have as many cases, but at the same time it's a much smaller ship with a much smaller crew, and so I think proportionally you have the same problem with like you can't really operate these ships if a large portion of your crew goes down with the coronavirus. Also, it kind of highlights that the people on the ship work in tight quarters, work in certain departments, and so it may be that if 20 people on a destroyer have the coronavirus, it's not a big deal if those, are all spread out. But if it happens to be, 20 people who work with radar or with, one specific part of the ship, well, then that, is a much bigger problem. And I think that's part of what happened on the Roosevelt, whereas it had particularly impacted the core of people who tended to the ship's nuclear reactor.
Right. Yeah. Not everyone has an equally important position on a warship like this. So yeah. Some key people. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. The question I was getting around to is, have we seen any like, substantial change coming from the Navy, or are they just, kind of status quo? We'll let our sailors get set to, carry out these pointless operations?
Well, I know they have adopted some like new protocols and stuff, like especially after the Roosevelt. There was like one higher up Navy official saying something about, oh yeah, lessons learned after the Roosevelt. And it does seem like they kind of reacted a little bit quicker. They immediately sent out this special medical team to do all this contact tracing and testing and stuff. And then they're sending out another support ship with ventilators and all this kind of stuff on board. So it seems like they're maybe a little more prepared for it. But in terms of like adjusting their overall attitude, or like, some of the Navy commanders like complaining and saying, hey, like, I don't want to put my crewmen at risk, I'm not really sure. I can't really tell if there's been more, like if there's more people kind of coming around to the attitude of like that Captain Crozier guy who kind of like was really concerned about the outbreak and, took it really seriously, whereas the Navy seemed to take it less seriously. Now, though, yeah, it does seem like they've got some new protocols in place and stuff, but I'm not sure if they're, reconsidering any missions or anything because of it.
All right. Well, I now want to ask you about what's going on in Afghanistan. Over the past few weeks I've had you on the show, we've kind of updated this situation where there's what they call a peace agreement, at least in name, between the U.S. and the Taliban. So I guess how is that going at this point? And do we have peace in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so to the second question, no, unfortunately, no, not peace in Afghanistan yet. But just recently, the Kabul government, the one that is basically propped up by U.S. support, the president himself, actually, Ashraf Ghani, offered the Taliban a ceasefire deal for the duration of Ramadan, which I think started like April 23rd, and I think it goes till May 23rd. But Ghani said that they should put down their weapons for the duration of the holy month and try to focus on like taking care of the coronavirus outbreak in Afghanistan, where I think they've confirmed like 1,500 people have this illness and like 50 of them have died. There's probably way more people with it. That's just the ones they've confirmed through a test. That's always the case with these numbers. But on Thursday, unfortunately, a Taliban spokesperson came out and rejected that offer outright, saying like there could be no ceasefire agreement. That was impossible. He said it was irrational. And he said, like, the main reason we're still fighting is because there's still no agreement on this prisoner exchange issue, which is sort of like, they've been arguing over this for months now. And it's like the main sticking point between the two sides in their negotiations is like this prisoner swap. The Taliban have been demanding that the Afghan government free 5,000 of their prisoners, including some of their senior commanders. I think like a couple dozen of them. And then they're offering 1,000 captured Afghan soldiers in exchange. And this is all part of like the deal with the Taliban to withdraw. And unfortunately, though, the U.S., like as we've explained previously on the show, the U.S. did not really okay this with the Afghan government in Kabul. And so now they're still trying to figure this out. The government says they don't want to release some of these higher level prisoners because they consider them like killers. Like they've launched attacks and they consider them like I think like just recently, for example, a negotiator for the Kabul government said like, we can't let some of these guys go because they're just going to come back and capture a whole province. And so like that's what they're worried about, is that these guys are going to, immediately rejoin the battlefield. And so they're like really stuck at an impasse here, like especially over this prisoner exchange thing. And as long as they're unable to come to an agreement over that, the fighting seems like it's only going to get more intense, like as the U.S. continues to withdraw troops in this phased kind of stages. The Taliban have apparently been largely abiding by the deal they signed with the U.S., like not attacking American troops. And apparently, like even U.S. officials, like I think Mike Pompeo, even the other day, said that like they acknowledged that like, yeah, they're keeping their attacks to a minimum on Americans, but they have been escalating their attacks on Afghan troops after signing the withdrawal deal with us. Like they've kind of slowly been notching those up. They've just been mostly confining them to like more rural areas and avoiding like the major cities, I guess, because I think that was also part of the deal with the U.S. But last week was no exception to that. It got pretty violent. I think like more than 20 Afghan security forces guys got killed, dozens more wounded in these attacks on checkpoints that they man. One of the attacks was in Logar province, which is like just like 30 or 40 miles south of the capital city. It's a rural area itself, but it's still nonetheless pretty close to Kabul there. The Taliban is the most powerful in the south, in like the Helmand and Kandahar provinces, but they also have been launching attacks closer to the capital, sometimes in the capital, but I don't think they've done many of those since the agreement with the U.S. And so overall, the two sides in Afghanistan are still really struggling to agree on anything. And it's still really this central prisoner exchange issue that we've brought up several times in the show. That's the problem. And there actually may be, like, if you really look at it, there might be like 3 or 4 sides, actually, if you start considering like the factions within these groups. So like in the Taliban, I know there are some splits between like the military and political guys, like the political guys based in Pakistan and the military guys in Afghanistan. And then on the Kabul side, I think we've talked about this before, like there's still this major rivalry between President Ashraf Ghani and the former co-president guy, Abdullah, who basically like declared himself the winner of the previous election, and he's held his own inauguration ceremony, and he's setting up his own presidential palace. And so like all this internal strife and conflict on the Kabul side is not really helping, I think, the negotiations or improving the chances that they're going to be able to come to some kind of grand bargain or even agree on the prisoner swap thing. And so that's kind of where things are at right now. Like there's still kind of this like major impasse between the Taliban and the Kabul government. And then within the Kabul government now, there's still also this major split between Ghani and Abdullah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look like it's a situation that'll be easily worked out. One thing that I've been concerned about with Afghanistan is just, one of those countries where the healthcare system is depleted. Prisoners notoriously get bad healthcare anyways. And the prisoner treatment during this war on both sides has been disgusting and abysmal. And so, what happens if coronavirus runs through some of these prisons and suddenly there's a lot less prisoners to swap, or prisoners that were, maybe more valuable people you really wanted to exchange for different commanders or something like that, now can't be traded. And so I don't know. Do you have any concern like that this is going to get drug out so long that it just won't happen and the whole thing falls apart?
Yeah, I mean, like that seems like it's certainly it's in the cards right now. Like it's hard to say where this will go. I know a couple weeks ago it was like, things kind of go through, like there's spikes of optimism. Like suddenly it seems like Abdullah and Ghani might sort of come together and maybe as like a unified front, they're going to, be able to negotiate something with the Taliban. And then a week later, the Taliban shoots it down or, something happens. So there've been a lot of ups and downs in terms of like, like optimism and like what seems possible. But yeah, it does seem possible that this whole thing could fall apart. I mean, you've got this coronavirus outbreak in Afghanistan right now. That's certainly going to be a major distraction. That was part of Ghani's whole appeal for the ceasefire was like, hey, we need to really focus on this pandemic right now. And the Taliban does not seem willing to do that. So, yeah, I mean, I think that is it's a possibility.
So kind of staying on the same subject here, Will, with ceasefire agreements that may not be going anywhere. You've had a little bit of press around Yemen and this claim that Saudi Arabia has declared a unilateral ceasefire first 2 weeks, and now they're going to extend it for another month. The Houthis have rejected this ceasefire, and the Houthis are the group that kind of control the capital city of Yemen and have for the past 5 years. The Houthis reject this ceasefire as Saudi Arabia doesn't lift the naval blockade. They say, hey, this is part of the military kind of shutdown of our country, and so lift the blockade, then we'll recognize the ceasefire. Saudi Arabia refuses to do that. It seems like both sides are pretty firm on that. We're kind of at an impasse there. So to further complicate matters, you now, almost like in Afghanistan, where you have the split in government, the Southern Transitional Council, which was a part of the Saudi-led government that controlled southern Yemen, has broken off and declared their own government. Now, they've made this kind of declaration before and have said that, hey, we want to break off and just form a separate state, whereas the Saudi-backed government wants to control the entire country. Once again, which, at this point, the idea of Mansour Hadi, the current, at least in-name president of Yemen, ever ruling the capital city of Sana'a seems virtually impossible. And so, Will, I know you follow Yemen. I know you weren't completely up to date on this story, but I know that, you have paid attention to this split in southern Yemen between the Southern Transitional Council, STC, and then the Hadi-backed government. And I guess, this relationship has been patched up in the past. It's not like, the main backers for the Southern Transitional Council are the United Arab Emirates. And so it's very well possible that Saudi and the UAE worked something out, and the UAE pushes the Southern Transitional Council to incept the Hadi government. But, again, do you see any movement here on Yemen, or I guess I'm pretty pessimistic about movement forward in the Saudi ceasefire. I'm just wondering, can you give me any reason to be a little bit more optimistic here, Will, or are you seeing anything else about Yemen?
Well, unfortunately, I kind of agree with you. Like, I mean, I guess one thing we could one silver lining we could find here. Because like you said, I think it is possible, like the UAE will patch things together with the Saudis. And like you said, the UAE is like the main client for the southern separatist guys there in Yemen. But this could signal, like if they're unable to patch that back up, this could signal that the coalition is like really having some fractures and it's really starting to fall apart. And, we've seen some, internal strife and bickering, and some of which involving these southern separatist guys. Like, I think like last year there was some actual fighting between the southern separatist guys and like the Hadi government. So, like we might be seeing some kind of fracture here in the Saudi-led coalition. And, it seems like if they couldn't, like, at first, I think they had 9 countries behind them. Some of them were more or less in a token role. There were some African countries that were part of the coalition that I don't think really contributed all that much. But nonetheless, if they couldn't do it with 9 countries, if they couldn't defeat the Houthis under those circumstances, then as their coalition is falling apart and fracturing, and they're losing one of their major, clients there in the south, this might signal, the beginning of the end to the coalition. So there's my crack at optimism.
All right. So I think probably the big story amid coronavirus that's getting headlines right now, I'm seeing a lot of people tweet about, a lot of people that I don't think really understand what's going on tweeting about it. But the rumors of Kim Jong-un's death. And I know you've covered this at RT, Will, And last week on the show, I had mentioned that it seemed like that, it was being downplayed by both the South Korean media and the Chinese media. These are the countries that have probably the most intelligence of what's happening internally in North Korea. And so it seemed to me that if they're saying, this isn't true, and the report being so thinly sourced, and just knowing how the U.S. operates with, this kind of information warfare, it wouldn't surprise me at all if this was a CIA cooped up plot. But, it does seem now that maybe there's a little bit more rumor going on and a little bit more reason. Hell, I even saw TMZ reported that apparently Kim Jong-un is dead. And so if TMZ knows, then it's probably true, right, Will? Or, kind of let us know what's going on here.
Yeah. So this rumor has really snowballed over the last week or so, and it's getting a ton of attention now. It kind of started small and it's gotten bigger and bigger. And so I'll just kind of run down all the different claims and the sources and stuff for, what people are saying about Kim Jong-un and his health, all the claims that are flying around right now. There's been a lot in the last few days. And so this whole story started with a report in this South Korean media outlet called Daily NK, which is as you might guess from its name, it's mostly devoted to covering North Korea news. And their original story ran a week ago, and it had said that Kim had recently had heart surgery and that he was now in recovery somewhere in the east of the country. And they suggested that maybe this is why he had missed a recent public appearance, this ceremony in honor of his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, which is the first Kim to rule North Korea, who right now in North Korean culture is this god emperor, founding father kind of figure. So Kim missing that ceremony is kind of a big deal. And so that's something that this article had pointed out. And I think Kim was actually last seen on April 11th. And so he's not been out of the public eye all that long, but it's been a few weeks is enough to make you kind of wonder, and that's kind of what this article was saying. And however, later Daily NK, this news website, came out and they corrected their article to say that it was actually all just based on one single source, whereas they had previously said that it was based on multiple sources. As a story like this should have multiple sources. But so in journalism, your viewers might know this, but single source stories are considered kind of less reliable. Two is considered the very bare minimum. And especially if you have anonymous sources, and especially if it's for a really big claim like this about a head of state or something, you want to have more than one source. But nonetheless,
it's called a rumor. It's a rumor. Right. Somebody said that to somebody. A lot of people said things about Russiagate. And there was always one source that said Donald Trump was going down, and so often it turned out not to be true. So yeah. Especially I will say, and I'll let you get back to it, Will, it's just there's so little, especially any kind of Western or English speaking presence or media or anything in North Korea, that there's just so little known about it that I guess if anybody sees any report at all, they just pick up on it as truth because they're so desperate for information.
Right. Yeah. Reporting is extremely difficult in North Korea. There's very little information coming out of there about the government and the head of state about Kim that the government isn't itself putting out through its own official organs and stuff. And so, yeah, when you see a lot of these anonymous sources, you have to wonder who is this? Who are they talking to there? Is it sometimes they'll say if it's an official, but sometimes it's just someone familiar with the matter. And so that should make you, when you see that kind of language, it should make you kind of question all right, who's telling me this? But nonetheless, this Daily NK article kicked off all these rumors online. On Twitter, you had all these people saying that Kim is really unwell. He's in a coma. He has some kind of brain disease, people are saying. And then a lot of others were going with the whole heart surgery story. But not long after this, CNN then comes out with their own version of the story, of course, citing one singular anonymous U.S. official. And they said, though, that Kim did have surgery, but that he's also now in grave danger and he's basically on his deathbed. And so this really kind of kicked off some of the more extreme rumors, because Daily NK, they only said that he had heart surgery. They didn't really say that he was in a grave condition or anything. They said he was recovering. But CNN comes out with this one U.S. official saying that he's gravely sick. And then they got another nameless official to say that the U.S. was closely monitoring reports on Kim's health. But that doesn't add any corroboration to the actual central claim. To just say that, oh, yeah, we're looking at these reports doesn't mean that oh, yeah, Kim is actually ill. So they only had one guy willing to say that Kim was ill, and he wouldn't go on record to do it. So after the CNN story, things really kind of start escalating. And then you get like a few days ago, you had, I think you had a reporter at this Hong Kong TV station coming out saying that she had a very solid source that said that Kim is actually dead. And I think that she was the first one to actually come out and say that he was dead. Again, though, she had one single anonymous source. And this is kind of like a common thread throughout this whole thing, is like that's what a lot of this is based on. You had a Japanese magazine that came out recently and said that Kim is actually in a vegetative state or in a coma, like something had gone wrong with his heart operation. But again, they have one guy telling him this, a Chinese physician, they said. You had this other kind of, maybe a little more far-fetched rumor pop up from a guy named Jack Posobiec, who's with this like conservative right-wing outlet called One American News. And he came out and said that Kim indeed had heart surgery, but that he had a Chinese doctor come and do it, and the doctor had given him the coronavirus, he said. So, and his source was, again, U.S. officials, anonymous U.S. officials. So, you have all these kind of rumors flying around. But then on Friday, you had Reuters come out with the story, and Reuters tends to be a little less willing to kind of make these kind of accusations, it seems. But they came out and said that a Chinese medical team had gone over to North Korea to advise on Kim Jong-un, whatever that means. They were kind of vague about it. They didn't really elaborate. They said a medical team was sent there to advise on him. But Reuters cited 3 unnamed sources, people familiar with the situation, to back this up. But they also made sure to say that, like, they don't know what the medical team means. They don't know if Kim is actually ill or, they stopped short of making any actual claims about this. And the thing is, Reuters had previously run an article, like you had mentioned, of, citing these South Korean officials saying that, that these rumors, there's nothing to them. They use their standard way of dismissing North Korean rumors, saying that they had seen no special signs or no unusual signs. And then they also cited a Chinese official who said the same thing. And then you've also had Yonhap News come out and cite South Korean officials saying that, different South Korean officials from different ministries saying that they doubt this. And so there's a ton of conflicting anonymous sources throughout this whole story on both sides. But I guess adding some reasons that we might doubt this is a report from 38 North, which is another sort of North Korea specialty site. And they found that these satellite photos that show that they say show Kim's train parked near one of his compounds, and that this train apparently just showed up a few days ago. So they're saying that Kim could be alive at this compound, and that's why this train just showed up to go pick him up. It's like his private train. But we don't actually know, we don't know why this train actually showed up there. So this is not definitive. It's just a picture of a train. So that doesn't really tell us anything. But it might add a little bit to the skepticism side. And so overall, it's kind of hard to say what you should make out of all of this. There's all these claims going around. I'm kind of skeptical of the more extreme claims that Kim's already dead or he's in a coma or something. But I have to admit, there are a lot of people saying this. It seems like there's an army of anonymous sources saying that Kim Jong-un is somehow unwell or ill. And so, they could all be wrong or lying. That's certainly true. But I don't know. We should point out that there is a pretty big crowd of people making this claim, apparently. And it's also true that Kim has not been seen for a while, for a couple of weeks. And so you can't deny that part. He's certainly not been in the public eye. And so that could suggest that, that he's sick or unwell somehow. We can't really rule that out until we actually see him, come out and do another public appearance. But we should also, though, remember that there have been all kinds of false stories that have come out of North Korea. All kinds of nonsense has circulated in the Western corporate press about this country. On several occasions, they've claimed that some official was executed and then they end up popping up a few months later alive, that kind of thing. There's one case where everyone claimed that Kim Jong-un had executed his uncle and fed him to dogs. And, he may have had his uncle executed, but the part about dogs actually originally came from a Chinese satire writer who posted this on social media in China. And somehow this got picked up and you had all kinds of major news outlets reporting it as straight fact. And so I'm just saying you have to be kind of careful with some of these North Korea stories. Things are not always as they say over there.
Right.
Go ahead.
I suppose even that Kim Jong-un, has carried out several missile tests, in the month of March and seemed to be unable to generate any media attention or concern over the North Korea situation, assuming that's what he was trying to do with those missile tests. And so maybe this is his way to get some world attention. Is to, make up some rumors about his death. It quite seems to me that anything is possible here, that he's alive or dead or anything. And that I think in part goes to show how isolating North Korea from the rest of the world is ineffective, as now, you maybe do have a critical situation in a country that is highly poor, potentially has starvation and corona outbreak going on right now, that, has had this kind of mystical religious government imposed on them and indoctrinated within the population. And, if, so much of that government, did depend on the kind of baton being passed down through, a chain of, father to son. Well, this could be a real problem if Kim Jong-un doesn't have any children that are at least, of the age to nominally assume his title. I mean, I think Dennis Rodman says the guy has a couple kids, but if a boy is 16 and somewhat developed, maybe he could pull it off as, being a figurehead sitting there. Or who knows what's gonna happen? I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And if North Korea wasn't so frozen from the rest of the world, like through U.S. sanctions, we may have a better idea of what's going on there.
Yeah, definitely. And I agree with you. Like at this point, like it's anyone's, this could go in any direction. And that is a great point too, that like maybe this is some way to try to generate some kind of press. I hadn't actually considered that, but yeah, certainly maybe he's trying to get people to talk about North Korea in the situation. I know that he was keen on trying to like move the ball forward with Trump and trying to, have, a year or two ago throughout the Trump administration, Kim has shown some willingness to want to do that. And so maybe he's trying to bring some attention back to North Korea. But yeah, there's all kinds of questions right now about like, what the secession would be like. There's, as far as we know, he has no like successors chosen or anything. Some people have talked about Kim's sister taking over. I know just recently she'd been allowed to give her first like public statement, sort of as an official. And so, maybe they're grooming her for this kind of thing. But I don't know. Like I've seen other people, like analysts, talking about like culturally it might be weird to have a female leader in this country. So I have no idea where like things could head if Kim really is, incapacitated somehow. But right at this moment, I'm treating this all as rumors. Like you said, these are mostly single source stories, anonymous sources. I just want to see some evidence, or at least have someone go on the record to make this claim,
Right. Well, somebody who has, I think, a really good insight on this particular topic is Michael Malice, who did a whole bunch of research into Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, and wrote a kind of autobiography for him. It's a very interesting book to check it out. But one of the things he says is that, in the West and in the U.S., you have like common law, a way, kind of established that things are supposed to work. But you really don't have that in North Korea with this situation. And so anybody who's out there, I don't know how many like blue chats and a lot of other people too, but there were a few blue chats out there, saying that, oh, North Korea is going to have their first female leader before the United States does, and ha 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 about that and everything. I think those people, just be wary of anything they have to say, because it seems like they're pretending to have a lot of insights that they don't have.
Yeah, that seems to be a kind of common thing with North Korea. I mean, like you're saying, there's, we're talking about how it's notoriously difficult to get reporters in there, like, and it does seem like there's sort of like a cottage industry of people claiming to know what's going on inside North Korea, sort of like the equivalent of like a Kremlinologist,
Right. So I guess the last thing I want to talk about on the North Korea subject is something that I've seen Doug Bondow, Ted Galen Carpenter, Daniel L. Davis, Daniel DePetris, all write fantastic articles on it. Find all these, they're at TAC or National Interest, I think mostly. But essentially what they're all arguing is this is exactly why we need a nuclear deal in place with North Korea, because, if this country really is that chaotic and Kim Jong-un is really dead and there is a struggle for power, who knows who's going to end up, at head and in charge of all these nuclear weapons, or if, different generals will have different nuclear weapons. And, boy, Will, doesn't it seem like a good time to make sure that the North Koreans don't care at all about North America and just, make peace with them and let them solve and resolve their own problems? I don't know if you kind of see it the same way, but I just think that's a great point to make at a time like this. And it doesn't matter whether Kim is alive or dead or not. Going forward, we have to, negotiate with whoever ends up being the head of that state, to normalize relations with North Korea. That way, even if we don't open up, but just having an embassy in that country would give us a sense of what's on the ground so much more than currently is the case. And just more trade, more contact. You have more idea of what's going on in the country, and that those should be the steps we're taking. Also, maybe get them to reduce their nuclear arsenal, or make sure these things are somehow tracked by the IAEA, or you have a general sense of where the nukes are, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a situation like right now where there's sort of uncertainty about who might inherit this arsenal, North Korea's nuclear arsenal, that's certainly, you want to have some kind of agreement, something in place between the two countries. But, as you and I have, worked on, maybe we can throw our article in the show notes on, the negotiations between the U.S. and North Korea and sort of the failures there. The U.S., though, has has failed. Trump seemed to have had some inclination to want to do something like that, to get some kind of deal, a grand bargain with the North Koreans. But it's not worked out. And now it seems like, things have kind of sunk. There was a window for this to happen. And it seems like now that window is kind of unfortunately closed.
So the last thing I got for us today, Will, is this article on U.S. aid provided to Palestine, and the Palestinians saying we actually haven't seen it yet. So tell us what's going on with that money.
Yeah, so 2 weeks ago, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, came out and kind of posted this sort of self-congratulatory sounding tweet saying that the U.S. is going to give $5 million to Palestinian hospitals and households too, apparently. But he said hospitals and households to help them combat the coronavirus outbreak, where in between Gaza and the West Bank, they've confirmed, I think, 300 or 500 cases, depending on whose numbers you look at. Again, as always, there's probably more cases. That's just how many they've confirmed. But the State Department said that this money would be going to the Foreign Disaster Assistance Office, which is under the purview of the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. Who we may have covered them on the show before, but they have their own kind of sordid history. They've done quite a few things in sort of the mold of the National Endowment for Democracy, sort of doing regime changey stuff in various countries. Certainly they've done some real development projects and real that kind of work too, but that's who USAID is. That's who gets this money. And the State Department don't specify what the money is actually going to go for. They say immediate life-saving assistance. But that's all they elaborate on. But according to the ambassador, according to Friedman, a part of this involves funding hospitals, I guess. But however, last week, the Palestinian envoy to France, Salman al-Harfi, came out and said that Friedman is a liar. He said that Palestinian hospitals have not seen a cent of this aid, and that USAID gave $3.5 million of this $5 million sum to some of its NGO buddies. But he said that none of that has been spent at Palestinian hospitals. And he says he doesn't know how those NGOs are going to be spending that money, but he says he knows it's not going to be on healthcare for Palestinians. Now, I'm not totally sure how this Harfi guy knows, that no hospitals received any aid. I don't know, has he called every single hospital, or is there one central office that has to go through and he's aware that it hasn't gone through there? I'm not totally sure. He didn't fully elaborate on his accusation. He didn't actually name the NGOs either that USAID would be giving this money to. And that's something I would actually like to look into myself to see which actual organizations got this money and what they do. But nonetheless, this is the Palestinian, basically the Palestinian ambassador to France. I don't think they have a full diplomatic thing with France, but he's the equivalent. He's the envoy. And that's what he's saying. He's making this accusation that this American money is not going to Palestinian hospitals. So it's become a little bit of a controversy. Now, Friedman in his tweet is kind of patting himself on the back, saying the U.S. is the top humanitarian donor in the world and all this stuff. And that stuff is a bit ironic, I think, considering just how much aid to the Palestinians Trump has cut over the last couple of years. In 2018, the U.S. cut $200 million in aid from Palestinian agencies. They cut another $25 million that was specifically going from hospitals in 2018. Later, they cut $360 million from the UN agency, the Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, or UNRWA. So they've slashed hundreds of millions of dollars in aid from the Palestinians. And as a libertarian, I'm not a major fan of this international aid necessarily. But for them to slash all this assistance and then continue to feed the Israelis billions in tax dollars every year, helping the Israelis build up this military and surveillance apparatus to basically dominate the Palestinians with. And then they turn around and congratulate themselves when they throw a little bit of crumbs to the Palestinians. And we don't even know if they actually did in this case, this $5 million. We don't even know where it ended up. And so I don't know. I just find something kind of perverse and horrible about that. Even if I am ultimately skeptical of aid and stuff, I don't know. I think you could find something kind of screwed up about that. And we should also mention, too, the U.S. has frozen the funding of the World Health Organization. And they're not my favorite organization, but they are one of the only agencies right now helping to get test kits into Gaza and the West Bank. And that was something also that the envoy had said, too, that he said, like, if you really want to help us, then maybe don't, take away the WHO's funding. But yeah, for all we know, this money is going to be poured into some NGO black hole and never see the light of day. Like, we don't really know what it's going to be spent on. But I guess in the end, all we can really hope for, I'm going to try to do some work looking and seeing if we can find who's getting this money. But ultimately, I do hope that this envoy is just wrong and that maybe this will go to some good NGO that will, give some of this money to Palestinian hospitals. As I mentioned last time I was on, there's like 60 or 80 ventilators in all of Gaza and 70 ICU beds for 2 million people. And then the West Bank has like 250 ventilators. So we're talking like 5 million people in total and like a very small number of ICU beds and ventilators, the things that you need when the coronavirus gets really bad. And so they're like terribly ill-equipped for an outbreak right now. And so it is unfortunate. Like if they're gonna hand out this $5 million, I hope it does actually go toward its purpose of helping to combat the outbreak there.
Right. Well, I think it's a little bit the same thing. Like some guy in the United States who is now, let's say he worked at a gym, right? And now you cannot go to work. Like you've been laid off. Gyms probably got, like some of these gyms might actually shut down or something like that. And so it's really hurt, like somebody's life. It's like, well, giving them unemployment insurance at a time like this is a little bit different than, normal free market economic times. And, some guy slapped off at work for a while and finally just got, the ads or something like that. And so to apply that to the Palestinians, we know that the occupation, like by studies, has, artificially made them poor, but just that, goods can't cross their borders. They can't like get concrete in to rebuild their structures. They can't get permits to build anything in the West Bank. They can't open businesses. They constantly have their houses destroyed. They're thrown in jail for arbitrary reasons. So, their healthcare facilities and houses and other infrastructure has been bombed. So, like if you made somebody artificially more poor, giving them aid, even as libertarian, isn't something that I'm looking to cut. I have far bigger targets. Like let's cut the F-35. Let's cut one F-35, and we'll let the Palestinians have that money.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like illustrative to see like the U.S. government, what it's willing to blow crazy amounts of money on and what it's not. Like if we see they're willing to give this $5 million to the Palestinians, and how much are they blowing on, the F-35 or whatever. So I don't know. Those kind of comparisons are kind of, they're kind of illustrative sometimes, just to see what they're willing to blow our tax dollars on.
Right. Well, thanks for coming back on the show this week. And again, congratulations on hitting 1,000 articles over at RT. Hope to have you on the show a whole bunch more to talk about the next 1,000, and tell people where they can find your work if they want to, make sure they read all those articles you're writing.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a staff writer at RT, as Kyle said already. You can go to my Twitter handle, at WKPANCAP, and you can find all the stuff I'm writing. I actually have pinned at the top, too, my full author archive. So if you really wanted to, you could go and read all 1,000 articles I've written for RT all in one sitting. It might take you a while, but you could do that. I've also written some stuff for Consortium News, the Libertarian Institute, and the Daily Sheeple. Oh, and antiwar.com. So all those places you can find my writing at.
All right, man. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Kyle.